on sustainable solutions. And I'm Bob Costanza from the Institute for Sustainable Solutions here at Portland State. So we've remember that we are having this seminar series broadcast over the web. And we'd invite those web viewers to send in their questions when they're done. And also at the end, we'd like to have you join the discussion. So we have about 45 minutes of lecture, and then we have at least a half an hour for further discussion. So just come up to the microphones at the end, and we'll make time for some questions. And also remember, the students that are taking the Class C Espressa at the end. I think you probably know that by now. So tonight we're very pleased to have Pamela Yeh and Ian MacGregor-Fors talking about cities as ecological islands. And Pamela, I'll give them a brief introduction. She's assistant professor in the biology department here at PSU, and her background's in evolutionary biology, and she completed her PhD on speciation in birds at University of California at San Diego. She worked as a postdoctoral fellow on evolution of antibiotic resistance at the Harvard Medical School, and her interests include how urbanism affects species and how human use of antibiotics affects microbes in natural and urban habitats. Ian MacGregor-Fors is an ecologist that studies the effects that human activities have on wildlife species, focusing on the ecological drivers of relatively well-known patterns in urban and agricultural areas. He's also interested in developing new methods to contrast wildlife communities and describing the natural history and effects of invasive species, basically those that threaten native wildlife communities. So he has a BA in biology from the University of Guadalajara in Mexico, and an MS and a PhD in ecology from the National Autonomous University of Mexico. And he conducted postdoctoral work in the Institute of Ecology, the good one, right, in Veracruz, Mexico. And he's been at the Institute of Ecology as a faculty member since October 2011. So I think this is the way this is going to go. Is Pamela's going to give a brief introduction, and then Ian is going to take over and give us some more detailed talks. And remember, you guys, this is a seminar on solutions. So I hope you remembered that in your talk. All right. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Dr. Costanza, for the introduction. We're very excited to be here. And what my friend and colleague Ian MacGregor-Fors and I are going to talk about is urban ecology and evolution, and really what we can do to try to encourage the natural diversity within urban systems, within cities. So a few years ago, back in 2004, the UN had made this prediction, right, that most of the world will be living in cities by 2007. And this projection has turned out to be true. By now, by 2011, we have the majority of human beings in cities, in urbanized areas. And this has a lot of different consequences, not only for humans, but also for natural and native plants and animals and organisms, right? So we want to think about those effects and really think about solutions that I want to talk about the problems, but also talk about some of the solutions that we can implement, that we can consider as we think about urbanization and cities. So first of all, when we think about what happens in urban areas, one of the main changes in natural animal populations will be in density and diversity of individuals. So because I study birds and because Ian studies birds, we're going to mostly focus on birds, but you can imagine that a lot of these patterns are quite generalizable. So the first thing is that in birds, diversity almost always decreases in urban areas, in these cities. So instead of having a ton of different species, you now have much fewer species. The second thing that you see is that density almost always increases. So you actually have more individuals in the cities than you have in natural populations. And if you think about this, if you think about cities that are completely overrun by pigeons or by house sparrows or by starlings or crows. So you actually have larger numbers of individuals within the city but a much lower diversity level. So these are general patterns. And the final general pattern is that when we look at the types of species that are found in urban areas, the actual composition is usually not a subset of species from the natural areas nearby. They're usually birds that are particularly good at living in urban cities, right? So you're not actually just getting a smaller subset of diversity. You're actually getting a completely different, usually a very different subset, a different species. And these are generalizations, and I think Ian will probably talk a lot more about this and give some more details, but these are generalizations. And I want to point out that these studies really took off in the 1940s or so as people started to realize the kinds of effects that we're having on our natural populations as we build cities and as we develop natural habitats. Most of this, a lot of this really has been descriptive ecological changes. And one of the things that Ian will discuss in greater detail is how we can move from the descriptive to something that's much more quantitative. And from the quantitative, we can get much more specific solutions. So Ian will spend a lot more time talking about really the urban ecology effects and solutions for that. I want to also just spend a little bit of time to talk about urban evolution, though, because this is a topic that we don't hear a lot about. We know that when you talk about ecology, we're talking about abundances of animals, of individuals. But when we talk about evolution, we want to know, of course, how are these animals changing? How are these organisms evolving? And so over the last decade or two, there's been much greater interest in exploring this. And so I want to just give a background on how urban areas can affect potentially different organisms. So I want to talk about some of these and just go over quickly some potential novel selection pressures in urban areas. So the first thing that you probably that you see immediately is just the different amount and the different types of vegetation in cities versus in natural habitats, right? So in cities you just have usually much less green stuff, right? Fewer plants, fewer shrubs, less cover. And so this, for birds, this can affect all sorts of things like nesting, feeding, roosting. And so you might need to start evolving different preferences or different abilities if you don't have the right vegetation. Another point is that you have a lot of or at least a change in the types of predators that a bird might see. So along with humans, we have all these human commensals like rats, mice, house cats that can really affect the viability of a lot of species. So if you can evolve to be able to avoid these, then that will greatly increase your chance of being able to survive. There's also differences in things like light levels and noise levels, right? So you can imagine how light levels can affect all sorts of things like plumage signaling. A lot of birds signal, they're very visual. In general, birds are quite visual, and so they signal with their plumage patterns. There's a lot of communication done visually. And as well, noise levels can really affect the evolution of species, right? Because so many birds use song as a major form of communication and as a major form of mating and mating behavior, attracting mates, territorial defense. So light levels and noise levels can really have an effect on birds as well. And then we have things like different types of human structures that can either harm or assist in reproduction and survival, and effects of microclimate, because we know that cities are typically warmer than the natural environment by a small amount, but these small amounts can really have a huge effect and have a significant effect. And then finally, human activities, anything from feeding, adding bird feeders and feeding birds to construction, disturbing nests, disturbing different roosting sites can all have an effect. So I just wanted to point this out because there's really a huge focus on urban ecology, but we also are interested in not only just the numbers and the types of birds but that we're affecting, but also how we're affecting them. How are they actually changing as a result of urbanization? And then I want to I'm only going to spend like a couple more minutes because this is a seminar on solutions. And what I will say is for evolution, we're really just at the tip. We're really just sort of starting to understand what's going on, and we don't have many solutions, but I think this is the first step, okay? So I want to talk about some changes in urban habitats that you can't easily see. All the things I just talked about, you can easily see, right? You can easily visualize the difference in vegetation. Suddenly there's a lot of cats and a lot of mice around. There's things that you can see very easily, but there are also things that you can't easily see. And especially one of the main things that you can't easily see, but can potentially have a huge effect in urban areas is bacteria. And so I think, as you guys all know, there are many different species of bacteria. They're usually found at extremely high densities. So this is actually the tip of a pin, and as you can see the close-ups, you can see the large numbers that we're dealing with in general. Bacteria are found, basically everywhere we look. So even in very strange places and extreme environments, and of course they're very important for human health reasons. And so this is my last slide, but what I want to say is that for us and for thinking about evolution in urban areas, we don't know what the effects are. And one of the first things, we have this suspicion that all of this antibiotic use in hospitals, but especially in agricultural areas, is really increasing the density, the diversity, and the level of drug resistance in bacteria. We don't know for sure how that really works, but I just wanted to introduce this question because Ian and I are actually just starting working on this. We've been thinking about this for probably about a year. We just got a grant. We're starting this work, but we think that the first step to a solution if you think about things like trying to decrease the use of antibiotics in agriculture, the first step is to show this huge effect, and then to be able to take these findings to governmental organizations, to policymakers, to people within the community. And so for us, I know this isn't much of a solution, but for us this is sort of the first step, is to try to quantify the problem and to try to correlate it with human activity if it's the case. So we only suspect it, but right now a lot of this suspicion we don't, we need to have the backup. So this is. I want to talk about this. I wanted to mention this just because this is done right in Oregon, and it's really active work. But I want to now introduce Ian, who is going to talk at much greater detail about urban ecology, and he actually has some much more concrete solutions that he will focus on. And so, thank you.
Well, let me get my presentation on. Okay. Well, let me move this a little bit because I'm a little bit loud. Okay. Well, first of all, thanks for the introduction, and I would really like to thank Professor Yeh for the invitation and the ISS seminar team for making all this possible. And well, I'm here supposed to talk about urban areas and the cities as ecological islands. And one of the first things that popped to people's mind when talking about urban areas is why care about urban systems from a biological perspective point of view. And well, the issue here is that together with agriculture and the effects of some alien species, urbanization represents one of the most important causes of species loss. For example, for the U.S., here's a paper published on Nature from Check and Crossman, and here are the causes they found for species loss, and we have two columns. The one from the left side includes Hawaii and Puerto Rico, and the one from the right side does not include them. And they did this differentiation because the islands have very different, non-native species have lots of different effects on island systems. So when we consider the U.S. without the islands, we can see that urbanization ranks first as a cause of species loss. This is basically because when we urbanize, and well, I have a very Latin American perspective, so I hope it's similar here, but what we do almost always is we transform a previously anthropogenically modified or natural system into this new urban area. So what we do is we rip everything off, we leave it very very smooth. Then we put all the infrastructure we need, and sometimes we put some trees, which are basically exotic. So the fact of urbanizing an area per se is closely related to 4 of the main components of global change. Obviously, land use per se, you're changing from something else to urban, or you're including previously established urban areas in the following like metropolitan area. So it's also a land use change. Alien species are related to urbanization in different levels. And for example, one of them is we love birds, and we love cage birds, right? So since the 1800s, people brought birds to the continent because they were missing their birds. And right now, for example, the house sparrow has great effects throughout the continent. And that was just because one species introduction. And if we start talking about other things like rock pigeons or starlings, things get worse. And things get worse when we talk about synergistic effects of alien species. There are examples of introductions from different parts of the world, independent introductions that find a way to interact. Like there's this bird in France that it was introduced, and it found this plant from other part of the world which had these berries. And so the bird ate the berries and nested on the plant, so both populations went high, and it was a big problem. So alien species and urbanization act at different levels, and it's a very interesting topic. About biogeochemical cycles, well, not only biogeochemical cycles are altered in urban areas, but some are broken. So it's a very important part of the cycle. And climate destabilization, aka climate change, because we have lots of industrial areas in urban areas, and we have lots of cars and stuff. So per se, urbanizing an area is related to these 4 main components. And if we add to this that centralization of work sources is given in cities, then it's what Pam was telling you. The population growth was practically linear, and this was a paper published by Nancy Grimm and co-workers. And what they say is that like about 2009, 2010, the human population passed from being mainly rural to mainly urban. So if an alien came to the world and evaluated us like a zoological, from a zoological perspective, maybe they could say that although we're quite generalist, we're like our main habitat is urban areas, right? So this obviously, the aggregation of people in urban areas obviously has disproportionated environmental demands. So in a seminar I organized in Mexico, one of the main conclusions we had in this seminar was that cities act like black holes because they're very, very tiny areas that are carrying lots and lots of resources into this very tiny area. But the interesting thing about this very rare entity is that it has an unbalanced metabolism because lots of things come in, and the things that come out are not that eco-friendly, right? So this is this entity that's very weird, and we started studying just like 40 or 50 years ago. So as the seminar logo says, it's social, economic, and environmental are like the components we need to start studying together to get things done. And urban areas are where these 3 forces converge. So they're areas that we need to start studying. But it's really odd to talk about urbanization in this kind of seminars, since from my point of view, there are not such entities as sustainable cities nowadays. Obviously, this depends on the definition of sustainability, but it's a very, very complex comparison. Right? So it's crucial to study in urban ecosystems at different levels, from the ecological, evolutionary, social, economic, etc., in order to manage and plan landscapes accordingly. And one of the biggest issues is that urban areas are being planned just in the urban core. And this is a very important thing because there's this idea of urban ecosystems, including all the direct area of influence of urban areas, and this almost always includes the micro watershed or the entire watershed where the city is placed, right? So it's very important to start zooming out from the city and planning in a bigger area. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the effects of urbanization and biodiversity. And as Pam said, if we review what studies have published, is that in a gradient of urbanization intensity, species richness often declines gradually, while the abundance or density increases. And that's because species richness decreases because habitat is not available or not suitable, or there are more hazards in highly developed urban areas. And those species that are able to override all these effects then don't have competition and are able to exploit all the resources. So you have tons of pigeons and tons of house sparrows and tons of all these kind of birds. And you have tons of mice and tons of cockroaches and stuff. So species richness declines as the density increases. But in some places, in some very specific wildlife groups, we have found a hump-shaped relationship. So this is related to areas where are very lowly urbanized, have low species richness, which is the same for very highly urbanized areas, and intermediate areas have this very high species richness values. And this is basically related to the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, which says that all the species found in these two areas are both in the intermediate areas. So that's one of the points that is very important, not only to study species richness, because the set of species that are here are very and contrastingly different, right? So making generalizations is quite difficult because each urban area is a different entity with different traits and different histories. So sometimes I get the comments like, why are you doing that project in Mexico City if it was done like in Singapore or New York or everything? And I'm like, we're like finding very different results from other parts of the world, and that's logical because we're in another part of the world in different conditions, and the way we urbanize is very different from the way people urbanize in other sides of the world. So this is another very important point, that we need to start studying every single city we're going to manage, because if not, if we're going to get knowledge from other parts, then we can make solutions that have bad endings. So which are the mechanisms that affect all these patterns? And basically, as Pam said, as ecologists, the first thing we did is go out to the field, and we concentrated on parks or places where we could find trees and we found like obvious positive relationships between diversity and lots of vegetation. And later on, we started studying socioeconomy. So people started saying, okay, wealthier people can have more resources and then have this very large garden and stuff and trees, and poor people don't. And they started finding relationships. For example, here in Arizona, they found that this luxury effect that they call. So people with more money have more biodiversity than people with less money. And this is a very important thing because it's related to a very, very large movement of environmental justice. Also, we have been studying population density effects on urban biodiversity and the effect of predation also, because sometimes there's one study from the US that actually says that, for example, for birds, predation can be relaxed, but studies from all over the world say the contrary. So we believe that one of the main forces driving urban biodiversity to be poor is that those amount of cats and rats and house sparrows and this kind of pests are basically predating from the nest or adult individuals. But all these factors are site-specific, and we have forgotten a lot about the geographic scale. So if we look at a city or an urban area from a geographic perspective, how does it look like? For example, this is Coatepec. This is a small town near the place I live. And this is a very compact city where you have very well delimited boundaries. And this is, for example, the case of Beijing. This is a zoom in Beijing. And although it's a very, very highly densely populated and urbanized area, what we find is a very, very densely urbanized area and then some gaps between them because they're very different ways to urbanize. But from a geographic perspective, we could say that Coatepec is like a large island and Beijing is like an archipelago. So, if urban areas look like islands, regardless of their scale, do they behave as such? So this is one of the questions that has been addressed in the last few years. Davis and Glick said that each city is a collection of habitat islands which may be considered either individually or collectively. And this is the same idea I showed in the last slide, like the large island or the archipelago. But look at the year of this publication. It's 1978. And it's been almost 30 years, and nobody had done anything about this subject. Everybody concentrating, or most people concentrating on the site-specific traits. So one of the first very, very nice publications was from a French group of colleagues which conceptualized like urban areas having this semi-permeable membrane in which some bird species could pass and others bounced, right? So what they called the urban adapters or tolerant species and the urban avoider or intolerant species. So what they found with this set of species that could pass had some traits that were very, very unique of those species, and those that bounced had a very unique trait of species. So this is one of the points that managers could focus on, because if you are avoiding the urban area, it's because you're not finding all these things you need. So for example, the avoiders are shrub, aquatic, or open habitat, solitary, migratory, ground nesting. So basically, they're not present in the city because they don't have where to nest and because there are not enough open areas. So you can start making those kind of places for those species to be in, and you can start mitigating the effect of urbanization. So if compact cities are semi-permeable and their borders are ecologically significant, I carried out these 3 questions. If they behave as ecological islands and are semi-permeable, does biodiversity fade in relation to the source, and does the size of human settlements matter? And these are 2 very basic island biogeography questions. So by the answer to these questions, we would be able to know if cities act as ecological islands. So in the first step for this, evaluating if the border of the city is really like this permeable line or if it's like an area, what I did is I proposed last year this very easy to use method in which you just draw the urban the polygon of the city, and then you draw a smoothened city polygon and measure the distances, the larger perpendicular distances between both polygons, and generate this area where you have like 95% of this ecotone between urban and non-urban areas. So this looked very nice, but we didn't know if it was ecologically significant. So what I did is I surveyed birds in the intra-urban area in sites with very, very similar site-specific traits in relation to the peri-urban areas I sampled. And what I found was a significantly higher species richness in peri-urban areas than in intra-urban areas. So regardless of the site-specific traits of urban areas, it matters a lot in which part of the city you are placed. So moving on to the fading from the source question, what we did is we used Mexico City as a model, and here the orange circle is the historical center of the city, which approaches the centroid of the polygon, which is broadly here in the segmented line. And what we did is here we have like a natural corridor, and here we have a preserved, very well preserved forest area. So what we did is we selected parks every 3 kilometers, trying to assure that they were like same sized or the best we could, And we assured that in a 1 square kilometer area, more than 80% was built cover, not to have the effect of other green areas. And what we found was very interesting. Species richness declined in relation to the city center, the distance to the city center, while the density increased. So this not only happens in urban gradients as such, but it happens when you move away from the non-urban area source. And the interesting thing here is that we found a threshold between 9 and 12 kilometers, because these are only the curves, but each one of these points have like statistical values. So the difference was found in between 9 and 12 kilometers for both richness and density. And when we analyzed the composition of these communities, what we found was more interesting. In this case, it's the similarity of the community in relation to the source. So as you move into the city, you start losing or fading the community. So when you're very close to the forest, you have very similar communities. But as you move away, it doesn't matter that you're an urban park, you fade out. And when we analyzed it from multivariate perspective, here we have like 3 clusters. The 0 would be like the forest, the preserve. And then we have all the urban parks, which differ greatly from the source, but have 2 clusters. And they're like the 3 and 6 kilometer cluster and the 9 to 15 cluster. So something is happening between 6 and 9. And considering the other result, we have something happening like at 9 kilometers away from the border, right? So, So this is a very important result to manage Mexico City, because we know that birds are able, if you have urban parks, birds are able to get into the city and be similar to the forest area 9 kilometers away. But if you don't do anything to manage or to attract birds in another way, that's as far as you go. Okay? So for the city size question, what I did, this is part of my PhD dissertation, is I surveyed 13 urban areas from the state of Michoacán in central western Mexico. And I surveyed from a very, very small, very highly urbanized small urban area to the city capital, Morelia, which is 106 square kilometers. And what we found is we found a perfect Wilson and MacArthur patch size species relationship, a positive relationship independently of sampling size. In this case, we only used 6 samples for each urban area, because the smallest area we could only sample 6 times to be independent samples. So we found a positive relationship. So the bigger the city is, you have more species. It doesn't matter if we sampled 2,000 times or 2 times. And when we analyze composition, and this is the most interesting result from here, we have three patterns. The first thing is that we have this very small basal part of the dendrogram, which indicates that all cities share a basic package of species, right? So it doesn't matter what size you have, you're going to get. You have an urban area, here is your basic package of species. House sparrows, rock pigeons, blah, blah, blah. Then, if you are a small urban area, you're in the black cluster, you're going to get, independently of your size or the matrix that is surrounding the urban area, you're going to get a very similar set of species. And if you're larger, here in the white cluster, you're going to have another set of species. So what we found is that, for example, these 3 cities, are the largest one, 106.4 square kilometers, is Morelia. It's surrounded by forests in one part and by agricultural areas on the other side. And the one of almost 20 square kilometers is Uruapan, which is basically surrounded by forests and by orchards that are very different to maize or corn crop fields. And the last one, the smallest, 10 square kilometers, is Zamora, which is basically surrounded by cornfields. So they are immersed in very different landscapes, and nevertheless, they cluster together. And this is basically because when cities start growing, habitat heterogeneity increases so much that you have now the cemetery, and you have the sports field, and you have the residential area. So you offer more and more habitats and more and more conditions for birds. So compact cities do behave as ecological islands, and thus isolation can override habitat effects. So it doesn't matter if we're doing very, very good management in a site-specific fashion, because if we're isolated from the border of the city, we're not going to have much effect, right? So the point here, and the very important question for this seminar, is this information valuable for biological conservation and or making cities towards a sustainable scenario? And from my point of view, I would say yes, but we don't have recipes. For example, I cannot come with my knowledge from Latin America and try to tell you what to do in Portland, because I don't know the story of the city. I've been here like for 2 days, and I've seen that it's a very green city. You have this river coming through the urban area. You have a very large green corridor. So you have lots of things that you could use to mitigate the effect of urbanization on wildlife and elevate some of the human health conditions, right? So remember, I talked about this social, economic, and environmental components, and we always try to include them, but sadly, we have a very strong bias towards environmental part. Or the sociologists have a very important bias to the sociological part. So right now, lots of working groups are being gathered throughout the world, trying to merge architects, designers, planners, managers, biologists, ecologists, because sometimes things we're proposing are not feasible from an architectural point of view, or some things that architects are proposing are not good from an environmental point of view. So this kind of interactive groups are being very important for the planning and management of urban areas. So one of my main proposals based on my research is that we need to start making urban green rings. So if the city starts growing, we could make rings every 5 or 10 kilometers. And this rings, there are some studies in Asia that suggest that the rings can be from 10 to 20 meter long or wide. So they can act like wildlife corridors. But not only urban green rings, but also networks among green rings from areas that were previously urbanized and are going to be included into the metropolitan area. A very similar idea was proposed by Zachariah and Imam in 2006 for like a very compact neighborhoods. And what they said is just establish a small and medium-sized urban green areas and connect them with trees in gardens or median strips. And this is going to start allowing biodiversity to move around. And my personal perspective or recommendation would be to set a ring around the neighborhood that isolates the urban area and that lowers the climatic condition, etc., etc. But the idea is to take this idea with the rings into a city scale. So doing this could dilute the effect of urbanization and offer higher habitat quality for both wildlife and urban citizens. And well, this is all for my part. And here's my email, and this is a blog that I have with some of my publications and so if you want for further information. Thanks.
Okay, questions or comments? Come up to the microphone. Say who you are.
Trevor. Anyways, does the age of an urban center also play into effect, like the size does?
Well, some studies have seen that the age of an urban area is closely related to the way of the architecture fashion. So, for example, for birds, we have seen that different types of architecture of the ages where the cities were founded affect biodiversity, but the age when they were founded does not really affect their size. That's like closely related to more economical or sociological dynamics.
Cool.
So I have one.
Okay.
So some of the advantages of cities are their density, for transportation and energy use and et cetera. So it seems to run counter with, building in a lot of green space. But what about the idea of green roofs and other ways to sort of make, green spaces, include green spaces, but keep the same urban density or even increase it?
Well, there are parts of the world where they have very amazingly new or novel ways to mitigate the effect of urbanization, like green walls. But for example, in the case of Mexico, if you want to set green walls in some of the houses that are already constructed, it's like not feasible. You can bring the house down. So again, we need to know the city and its processes and start coming up with new ideas of how to mitigate the effect of urbanization on wildlife and on climate. For example, this urban heat island is a very important effect because the heat is not being dissipated in urban areas, and this has been proved to affect human health, species diversity, etc. So I think that having compact urban areas is not the problem, but the way we construct them, design them, and live in them, that's a problem. I don't know if Pam wants to. Okay. Oh, yeah. Just don't say it was him.
Well, we actually have a colleague who has this very interesting idea, and we think it could be a solution. We didn't want to really bring it up because it's a little bit odd, but he thinks, so this isn't actually our idea, we actually like it, but he thinks that one of the solutions for this is actually to start building underground, to really have these extensive, instead of building up, to have these extensive underground dwellings, and that could potentially mitigate some of those issues. So if we have extensive underground dwellings and we're all living underground, then we can still have all the trees and the forest outside. And my lab and my office is like in the basement and the sub basement, and I suspect that our colleagues maybe is too, because this is maybe what got him to thinking, because we essentially live underground. And so, as we were talking about it and thinking, trying to think about possible solutions, we know that not all of these solutions make sense, but we're trying to see what we can come up with that might enable us to really retain those benefits of living in cities, like the compactness, the fact that we can get everything very quickly, we can have higher densities of people and have a smaller physical footprint, but still be able to have all these natural corridors and these native habitats. So that's one idea, but we're not sure it's going to fly anytime soon.
My name's Leslie Bliss-Ketchum, and I'm a PhD student here at Portland State. And, I study road ecology, so of course I want to bring up that, a big urban effect is roads, and even for birds, which we imagine could fly over roads, can be impacted heavily. So not only to bring up as an important factor in the evolutionary processes, their interactions with roads for wildlife in general, but also the idea of the rings could pose a problem for species that need to go over. And so mitigating the effects of roads would also need to be included in that concept. So, thank you.
Yeah, in fact, if I understood your commentary completely, there's some new kinds of roads in the Netherlands they're making where you can have like the ring and the roads go down, and it's it's not that expensive, and you can keep the corridors. Or there are ways. The problem is that we have to permeate our ideas to the government and to the planners and the managers, and I think that's the big step we have to make now.
Okay, a couple online questions. For those of us who are less familiar with what a green ring is, maybe you could describe that in a bit more detail, and why around the border versus like nodes of green space. And then related to that, how does vegetation selection affect what you're planting affect species diversity and the effectiveness of a green ring?
Well, that's a very good one, because that's one of the things that in Mexico we have been having much problems, because we have all these specialists, botanists discussing over which species to plant, right? Because we don't even really know what was the vegetation in the urban area prior to urbanization. So basically, what we plant in the city is going to be like something we believe was native or it's near the city. So I think we should replicate similar conditions to the non-urban, the immediate non-urban area. That would be a good way to do it. And about the green ring, is basically, instead of tearing everything away and just urbanizing, we can start leaving urban areas like urban green areas that make a ring around the city. So cities start sprawling, and then you just connect them with roads or something, and then it continues sprawling, but you keep this kind of green rings, like circular urban parks throughout the complete circumference of the city. So the idea here is that they should be like wide, so they can act like corridors, and they should be connected to median strips which are basically proposed to be 3 or 5 meter wide, and this could mitigate like the effect of wildlife species not coming into the city because they can physically not come into the city, right? I don't know if this answers your questions.
I have another question.
Okay.
While the next one's coming up. So wildlife is one element, but it seems like there's a much broader range of ecosystem services that these natural areas provide. And I guess the question is, when you're designing these green spaces, shouldn't you take that broader spectrum of services into account? And why would you necessarily think that you need the same group of species in those areas that you have in adjoining areas? I mean, why wouldn't this be a novel ecosystem that would have to adapt to the novel conditions that you're placing it in? But there's hydrologic control, there's temperature control, there's lots of other things in addition to wildlife that you should probably take into account. So have you thought about that? I mean, that's going to make a major influence on the design of these green spaces and the design of cities if you're really trying to maximize sustainability.
This is basically the reason why we are proposing multidisciplinary groups, because we ecologists always want like habitats for wildlife species, etc., and we want native species to be present because they have positive effects on biodiversity. But this is a very important view because, for example, we have a sociological study in the city of Morelia where we were able to evaluate people's perception, and there are some native trees people don't like and they kill them. So if you plant that tree, they're going to kill them. So there's no any positive effect of planting native species. So you have to include the sociological part. You need people to take care of the trees, not to kill them. And you need trees and all plants and all animals to provide all these ecosystem services. And I'm totally with you. The issue is that we cannot have the experience on all the perspectives. So we need these multidisciplinary groups, right?
My name is Max, and my question is, should we be how would you get rid of pigeons in the city? Or should we be getting rid of them, or could we design something outside the city that would encourage them to move out of the city? Or, I mean, just the whole pigeon issue. Can you explain a little bit?
Okay, this is... Yeah. Pigeons have a very important sociological component because there's some people that don't go out from the city in their whole lives, right? So their very unique contact with nature is the trees they have in the city, pigeons, sparrows, crows. So if you take out those species, you're going to have a negative sociological effect. But pigeons also have human health effects, and this is the reason why, for example, in Spain, there's some places in Spain that you cannot feed the pigeons, and you get fined. Yeah, that's right. So because they don't only have human health issues, but they have negative effects on the architecture. Yeah. So this is a very important point. It happens with house sparrows in Mexico. There's so many, and they're having so many effects. But for example, there are people, like Greenpeace people, that don't like us to even think about killing anything, right? So it's a complicated process. It would be important to lower their populations. That would be important. I don't think that extirpating them would be even possible, because they're actually like rats or cockroaches, and their reproductive strategies are so good that in 1 year maybe you can kill thousands, and in the other year you're going to have the same population. So I think we should start managing these pests to lower their populations rather than to extirpate their populations. Yeah, please.
And the thing about pigeons, the thing about rock doves, is that our urban habitats mimic very well what they naturally like, which is these long. They're normally found on the cliffs and these large, very flat surfaces on cliffs, and they like to nest in. And they're extremely gregarious, so they're social creatures. They like to roost and to nest in these big areas, and that's what we have in cities. We have these large flat plazas, we have these large flat mall areas, walking areas. Just any big, large, flat surface, to them it looks very much like their natural habitat. And so, and also they like to nest on, as well, they like to nest on flat surfaces, so on roofs. One of their favorite places, I don't know if we have a lot of these here, but on the East Coast, there's all these window ACs that are in the windows, and so these are perfect areas actually for pigeons to be nesting in. And so, as far as thinking about extirpating them, or at least reducing them, as Ian was saying, one of the things that we can do is to have urban designs where we don't have the habitat features like these large flat areas or these smaller secluded areas for roosting and for nesting. And I think some cities have started to realize that and started implementing some of these ideas as far as getting rid of essentially what most people consider a pest species like the pigeon.
Hi, my name's Sean Sullivan. I have a question pertaining to birds, actually. There's a forum online known as TED, or TED, and there was a presentation on there that I forget the presenter's name, but he suggested teaching the common crow to he focused on their intelligence and their ability to solve problems, and he was suggesting that a possible way to contain or deal with the issue of crows in cities was to teach them to pick up garbage, because they can solve puzzles with picking up quarters and putting them into a slot, and on several different levels of difficulty. And so he has this idea of training them in cities to do tasks for humans that humans would consider productive. So obviously we're not going to train rats or train mice to carry messages to people or anything like that, but I was wondering if you favored this idea of having the natural ecosystem and the life forms in it living in a hybrid existence with the human presence, or if you want to leave the park strips entirely just in their ecological original state and just have them unaffected by humans and have this green ring that is still, or I guess, would you prefer a hybrid or just the sole natural forms that are found in nature? I mean, when you have the green ring, it's set up as such so that you want to have this presence of natural forms, and you want that there. But are you opposed to having? I guess not. I guess the essence of the green ring itself is to be in existence with the urban setting. but what about the life forms in it? Would you favor the idea of teaching crows to pick up garbage and still live in this green ring, I guess? Okay. Or are you open to more innovations as they come down the tube in the future?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think that's a very good question. And I think when you have urban rings and urban parks in general, I think you really want to maximize the use of it. So you really want to be able to. For us, well, from my personal point of view, and I think everybody probably has a slightly, different take on it. But I think, for me, I think you want to maximize the use in terms of having wildlife be able to use it, and also have people be able to enjoy, to be able to enjoy these green spaces. So in that sense, from my perspective, I think it'd be great if we had a nice mix. I love the idea about crows. I've seen them do some amazing things, but I think. I don't know about picking up trash. And,
it was kind of an interesting video. I didn't really ever think that you could teach a large population of crows to do one task like garbage men for the entire city. But I guess my comment was more towards the manipulation of. We're still, in a sense, that would be manipulating the natural life form. So just wanted to know. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
They should.
While the next one's coming up, that brings up an interesting question that, there really are no pristine ecosystems on Earth any longer. And humans have been, part of this system for Homo sapiens, at least for, 200,000 years, and have had major influence on it. So what exactly are you trying to create? Why is the goal really to create sort of what's outside the city, or to create something that maybe works in a unique way? Why not create a unique ecosystem rather than replicate something that doesn't really fit? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Want to try that one?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, and let me just make sure I understand what you're saying. So the point of, I think that what you're saying is that urban areas can be their own unique ecosystems, and we can think about that. And I think that's completely valid. But I think there's a couple of concerns, because so much of so much of our planet is now urban areas.
Well, it's not really that big a percentage of area even now.
Okay.
It's still
right.
Less than 10%.
Okay.
5%.
Okay. Well, okay, a percentage is in an urban area. I think that the bigger concern is that in particular this kind of density and diversity issue that we see. So as we in itself, in a vacuum, if we have all of these house sparrows and all of these pigeons and crows and starlings and so on, I think that could be interesting in of itself. But because at the same time we're seeing a huge decline in a large number, and Ian, you might know this, I don't know this number, but the percentage of songbirds are declining, what percentage of other birds, other mammals are declining. I think the concern is just also at the same time, not just the expanding urban areas, but the loss of natural habitats. And so as a result, we want to think about being able to preserve the natural biodiversity that we see in any way we can. Now, I think the easiest way is not to try to turn urban systems into a subset of the natural system, but to try to preserve natural habitats. But I think of this as just a supplementary way to try to preserve diversity. But I think I understand your point that urban systems by themselves are also natural habitats. They're extremely new. Evolutionarily, they're quite new. And I think that's one of the issues that it poses as a challenge for species, because it's been so rapid and so new that a lot of species are having trouble being able to adapt quickly enough. And that's why we see this huge decline in the number of species that we find.
Take it maybe even a step further, because you're saying, urban areas are like islands, and islands create endemic species that are unique. And so, in fact, you could, think of urban areas as creating an opportunity to increase biodiversity, not just preserve what we have, and to generate new, unique species that are more adapted to that environment, just like islands do.
Yeah,
of course, you'd have to speed it up quite a bit.
That would be an interesting perspective, but we really don't know what's going to happen, right? We know, for example, that house sparrows from Europe and house sparrows from this continent are diverging genetically. So, and we're having different house sparrows in northern North America and in southern North America. So, yes, we can have starting different things in urban areas, but the issue here is not only ecological. From the human health perspective, having very densely urbanized areas has very negative effects on human health. So one of the things is that if you make less developed or less gray urban areas, you can have positive effects on both wildlife and humans. So it's not all about preserving wildlife species. It's also about a human health perspective.
Yes, Tom Despain. The follow-up to the conversation here. I was recently at the Highline Park in New York City, and which is a circular part through, not completely circular, it's more linear, but it runs up and down Lower Manhattan, and it's about 5 meters wide. I don't know how long it is, but they introduced 2 or 3 species of bees, and then after a year or two, they discovered that they had a total of 8 different species. And I'm wondering if so there was some infiltration from a native species, and I'm wondering if your concept of these green rings would if you have considered this type of an effect. And certainly bees are pollinators, and in this particular case, and so they would be servicing, say, urban gardens. There's many urban gardens in New York City, for example, and so you get this kind of interactive and ecological pattern that you were speaking of. But I'm wondering how specific a look at the various species are you taking in terms of these green rings? Are you trying to duplicate a complete ecological system within them, or what?
Well, the issue here is this is like a restoration ecology question, right? Because we're always trying to replicate what we had before, but the problem is we don't have any reference left anymore. So what people are basically doing is, as I said before, taking the most similar condition to what we think was in the area before the city was established, and start making some experiments and seeing what happens in different cities, in different areas, with different lengths and with different widths. And we're always, as we manage the landscapes, we're going to have different positive effects, side effects, and we have to be able to monitor them and to manage them and to change the processes to keep on planning the landscapes accordingly in order to maintain ecosystem services, biodiversity, human health, etc., etc. So it's a very new area of study, and we need to be recommending things, and we don't have much data, so it's like a very rapid process, and it's being very complicated in the application perspective, right? But I don't know if you want to say something else.
Okay, maybe that was the last word. So let's thank our speakers again, and we have some refreshments in the back. So stay after, and you can have some more detailed discussion and questions. All right, thanks for coming, and we'll see you next week.